The tears sliding down Delilah Armstrong's face gleamed in the harsh Wyoming sun as she knelt beside her father's grave, her slender fingers tracing the freshly carved letters on the wooden marker. The year was 1876, and at 22 years old, she found herself utterly alone in the unforgiving frontier town of Cottonwood Springs. "Look at her, weeping like a child again," came a sneering voice from behind her. Delilah didn't need to turn around to know it was Harriet Simmons, the banker's wife whose tongue was sharper than any knife in the territory. "Hasn't stopped crying since they put old Armstrong in the ground 3 days ago," another woman added. "Pathetic display if you ask me. Woman her age ought to show some backbone." Delilah pressed her lips together, willing the fresh wave of tears to subside. The townswomen had never accepted her, not since she and her father had arrived 5 years ago. Benjamin Armstrong had been respected as the town schoolteacher, but his daughter was viewed with suspicion too educated, too refined, too emotional for frontier life. She rose to her feet, brushing the dirt from her simple black dress, and turned to face the small gathering of women who had stopped to observe her grief with critical eyes. "Good afternoon, ladies," she said softly, her voice steady despite the moisture still clinging to her lashes. Harriet Simmons clicked her tongue. "Still at it, I see. Your father has been gone 3 days, Delilah. Time to dry those endless tears and consider your future. No man wants a weeping woman for a wife." "Some of us were wondering if you'd be selling your father's house," another woman interjected, not bothering to hide her interest in the modest but comfortable home Delilah had shared with her father. "I haven't given it much thought," Delilah replied, though the truth was she'd thought of little else. The house was hers now, but without her father's teaching salary she had no means to maintain it. "Well, you'd better start thinking," Harriet said with a cruel smile. "Unless you plan to marry soon, which seems unlikely given your delicate disposition, you'll need to find a way to support yourself." The women's laughter followed Delilah as she walked away from the graveyard, her head held high despite the fresh tears threatening to spill. She was nearly at the edge of town when she heard hoofbeats approaching from behind. "Miss, you dropped this." The deep voice made her turn. A man she'd never seen before sat atop a magnificent chestnut stallion, holding out the small handkerchief she must have dropped at the cemetery. He wore the dust of the trail and the confident posture of someone accustomed to hard living. His eyes were a startling blue beneath the brim of his hat, and despite her distress, Delilah found herself momentarily speechless. "Thank you," she finally managed, reaching for the delicate square of fabric. As she took it, the man's eyes lingered on her tear-stained face, but unlike the townswomen, there was no judgment in his gaze. "I'm Luke Patterson," he said. "Just rode into town." "Delilah Armstrong," she replied automatically, tucking the handkerchief into her sleeve. "Welcome to Cottonwood Springs, Mr. Patterson." His eyes flicked to the cemetery behind her, then back to her face. "My condolences for your loss, Miss Armstrong." Delilah blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "The black dress, the fresh grave, the tears," he said simply. "I recognize grief when I see it." A few of the women from town were passing by, and Delilah heard their whispers, saw their knowing glances and suppressed laughter at the sight of her tear-streaked face. Luke Patterson's jaw tightened as he observed the interaction. His voice dropped lower, meant for her ears alone. "Don't mind them. Some folks mistake tears for weakness, but I've always figured it different." "How so?" Delilah asked, curious despite herself. "She cries because she still feels," he said, his gaze holding hers steadily. "And in this world, feeling anything at all takes more courage than most will ever know." Something shifted in Delilah's chest, not healing, not yet, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that healing might someday be possible. "I'm staying at the boarding house while I look for work," Luke continued, nodding toward the 2-story building at the end of the street. If you need anything help with heavy lifting, a fence mended, I'd be happy to assist. That's very kind, but no obligation, he interrupted gently, just an offer from one stranger to another. Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and continued riding toward the center of town, leaving Delilah to wonder about the cowboy who defended her tears when everyone else condemned them. The next morning, Delilah woke to the harsh reality of her situation. The pantry was nearly bare, and the small amount of money her father had saved wouldn't last long. She would need to find work, but in a town as small as Cottonwood Springs, opportunities for a woman were limited, especially one who had spent most of her time assisting her father with his teaching duties, rather than learning traditional feminine skills. She dressed in her simplest dress, no longer the full morning black, but a subdued gray that wouldn't show dust as readily. Her destination was the general store, owned by the kindly Mr. Garfield, who had always treated her with respect. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and Mr. Garfield looked up from where he was arranging a display of canned goods. "Miss Armstrong," he said with a gentle smile. "How are you faring today?" "As well as can be expected," she replied, the practiced response coming easily to her lips. "Mr. Garfield, I was wondering if you might need some assistance in the store. I'm looking for work." The older man's face fell slightly. "I wish I could help you, Miss Armstrong, but business has been slow lately. I can barely afford to pay Tom for his deliveries." He gestured toward the teenage boy who was sweeping the floor. "I understand," Delilah said, trying to hide her disappointment. "If you hear of anything—" Of course, of course. Though you might try the hotel. I heard Mrs. Winters saying her maid just left to get married." Delilah nodded, though the thought of working for Mrs. Winters, who was close friends with Harriet Simmons, made her stomach tighten with dread. Still, she couldn't afford pride. Not now. She had just turned to leave when the door opened again and Luke Patterson walked in. His eyes found hers immediately, and he offered a small nod of recognition. "Morning, Miss Armstrong." "Good morning, Mr. Patterson." He turned to Mr. Garfield. "I'll need supplies for a few weeks' work: nails, rope, some canned goods. I've taken on repairing the old Miller place out on the eastern edge of town." Delilah's ears perked up at this. The Miller homestead had been abandoned for nearly a year after the family moved to California for Mrs. Miller's health. It was a substantial property with good water access and fertile soil, but the house and barn had fallen into disrepair. "Planning to stay in these parts, then?" Mr. Garfield asked as he began gathering the requested items. "For a time," Luke replied, his eyes drifting back to Delilah. "Depends on how things work out." Mr. Garfield's gaze moved between them, a hint of speculation in his expression. "Well, we can always use good men in Cottonwood Springs. Too many drifters passing through these days, causing trouble at the saloon and such." Luke nodded absently, his attention still on Delilah. "I heard you asking about work." Heat rose to her cheeks at being overheard, but she lifted her chin. "Yes. I need to support myself now." "I could use some help at the Miller place," he said. "The inside of the house needs a thorough cleaning before I can properly assess what repairs are needed." Delilah blinked in surprise. "You're offering me work?" "If you're interested. It would just be for a few days, but I'd pay fair wages." She hesitated, aware of Mr. Garfield watching their exchange with undisguised interest. Working alone with an unmarried man could damage what little reputation she had left in town, but the prospect of a few days' wages was too tempting to dismiss outright. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Patterson, but I'm not sure it would be appropriate." Understanding dawned in his eyes. Of course, though Mrs. Miller left quite a lot of furniture and household items behind. "I was planning to speak with Reverend Collins about having some of the church ladies come out to help sort through it all. Perhaps you could join them." It was a graceful solution, and Delilah felt a rush of gratitude for his quick thinking. "That seems like a reasonable arrangement," she agreed. "When would you need help?" I'll be heading out there tomorrow morning. If you could come by around 9, with whatever others the Reverend can gather, that would be fine. Thank you, Mr. Patterson. I'll speak with Reverend Collins this afternoon. As she left the store, Delilah felt the first stirrings of hope she'd experienced since her father's death. It wasn't much, just a few days of work, but it was something. And there had been something in Luke Patterson's eyes, a kind of steady strength that made her feel less adrift in her grief. Reverend Collins was sympathetic to her situation and readily agreed to ask several of the church ladies to join her at the Miller place the next day. To Delilah's surprise, 4 women volunteered, including the Reverend's wife, whose presence would ensure the absolute propriety of the arrangement. The next morning dawned clear and warm. Typical for late spring in Wyoming. Delilah dressed in her most practical clothes and packed a simple lunch, then walked to the church where she would join the other women for the ride out to the Miller homestead. Mrs. Collins greeted her warmly, introducing the others Mrs. Baker, Mrs. Porter, and Miss Jenkins, a spinster who served as the church organist. None of them were part of Harriet Simmons's social circle, for which Delilah was deeply grateful. They rode in Reverend Collins' wagon, and as they approached the Miller place, Delilah could see that Luke was already hard at work. He had cleared much of the overgrowth from the front of the property and was mending a broken section of the porch when they arrived. He set down his tools and came to help the women from the wagon, his hands strong and sure as he assisted each one. When he reached for Delilah, their eyes met briefly, and she felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. "Thank you all for coming," he said, addressing the group. "The house hasn't been lived in for a while, but Mrs. Miller left most of her belongings. I'd appreciate your help determining what might be useful to keep and what should be donated to the church or others in need." A very Christian approach, Mrs. Collins approved. "Let's get started, ladies." The house was dusty but otherwise in good condition. The women set to work opening windows to air out the musty rooms, sweeping floors, and taking inventory of the furnishings and household goods. Delilah found herself assigned to the kitchen, where she began washing the dishes that had been left in cupboards and organizing the space. Through the window, she could see Luke working on the barn, his movements efficient and purposeful. Occasionally, he would look toward the house, and once or twice, she caught his gaze before he returned to his tasks. At midday, the women spread their lunches on the newly cleaned kitchen table. To their surprise, Luke joined them, bringing in a bucket of fresh water from the well. "The place is looking much better already," he commented, accepting the sandwich Mrs. Collins offered him. "I appreciate your help." "It's a fine property," Mrs. Baker said. "Are you planning to purchase it?" Luke nodded. "If things work out, I've been looking for a place to settle for some time now." "Where are you from originally, Mr. Patterson?" Miss Jenkins inquired, her curiosity evident. "Colorado, originally. My family had a ranch there, but after my parents passed, my brother and I sold it and went our separate ways." A shadow passed over his face. "He headed to California. I've been working cattle drives and odd jobs throughout the territories, saving up to buy my own place." "And what brings you to Cottonwood Springs specifically?" Mrs. Collins asked. His eyes flickered briefly to Delilah before he answered. "I heard it was a good community. Peaceful. The kind of place a man might want to put down roots." The conversation continued, with the women sharing local news and gossip. Delilah remained largely silent, observing Luke as he interacted with the others. He was polite and attentive, answering their questions with patience but offering little about himself beyond the basics. After lunch, they returned to their tasks. Delilah had finished with the kitchen and moved on to one of the bedrooms, where she was carefully sorting through linens and clothing that Mrs. Miller had left behind. She was so engrossed in her work that she didn't hear Luke approach until he spoke from the doorway. "Miss Armstrong, could I speak with you for a moment?" She looked up, startled. "Of course." He gestured toward the hallway, and she followed him to a small study at the end of the corridor. far enough from the others to offer privacy, but still within earshot should propriety demand it. "I wanted to ask about your situation," he said, his voice low. "Mr. Garfield mentioned that you're living alone now." "Yes," she confirmed. "The house belongs to me now, but maintaining it will be difficult without steady income." Luke nodded thoughtfully. "I have a proposition for you, but I want to be clear that it's a business arrangement, nothing more." Delilah felt her cheeks warm but met his gaze steadily. "What sort of arrangement?" "I'll need help getting this place in proper order, not just cleaning, but making it a home. Curtains, cooking, that sort of thing. Things I have little skill with." He ran a hand through his hair, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "I could hire you to come out a few days a week, for as long as you need the work." The offer was tempting more steady work than she was likely to find elsewhere, but also complicated. "People would talk, Mr. Patterson." "Let them," he said with a shrug. "We'd be careful about propriety. You'd only come when others are around or during daylight hours. And if you find more suitable employment in town, you'd be free to take it." Delilah considered his proposal. The money would allow her to keep her father's house at least for a while longer, giving her time to consider her future more carefully. "I accept," she said finally. "Though I should warn you that I'm not the most accomplished housekeeper. My father and I lived simply." A small smile curved Luke's mouth. "I've been living on cattle drives and in bunkhouses for years, Miss Armstrong. Any home cooking will seem like a feast to me." Before she could respond, Mrs. Collins called from downstairs, and they returned to their respective tasks. Throughout the rest of the day, Delilah found herself watching Luke when he wasn't looking, wondering about the quiet cowboy who had unexpectedly become her employer. As the weeks passed, Delilah settled into a routine, 3 days a week. She would ride out to the Miller place, now officially Luke's property, on a gentle mare he had purchased specifically for her use. She would spend the day cleaning, cooking, sewing curtains, and making the house habitable while Luke worked on the more substantial repairs and began preparing the land for a small herd of cattle he planned to acquire. True to his word, he was careful about her reputation. On the days she worked, he arranged for others to be present, hiring local men to help with the barn raising or the well repairs, ensuring that Delilah was never truly alone with him. When no other work was happening, he would ride into town on errands, leaving her to her tasks. Yet despite these precautions, Delilah found herself the subject of gossip once again. Harriet Simmons and her circle were particularly vicious, speculating openly about the real nature of Delilah's work at the Patterson Ranch. Some days, the whispers and pointed looks were almost too much to bear. It was after one such encounter at the general store, where Harriet had made a particularly cutting remark about Delilah's cowboy benefactor, that Luke found her crying quietly in the kitchen of his home. "Miss Armstrong?" he said softly, setting down the supplies he'd brought from town. "What's happened?" Delilah quickly wiped her eyes, embarrassed to be caught in tears again. "It's nothing. Just being foolish." Luke set his hat aside and pulled out a chair across from her at the kitchen table. "I doubt that very much. Please tell me what's upset you." She sighed, twisting her handkerchief in her hands. "It's the town gossips, Mrs. Simmons in particular. They've been saying unkind things about our arrangement." Luke's jaw tightened. "I see. I'm sorry if my offer has caused you difficulty." "No," Delilah said quickly. "I'm grateful for the work. It's just difficult sometimes, being the subject of their speculation." She attempted a smile. "And I'm afraid I've given them more ammunition with my tears. Mrs. Simmons saw me crying in the store last week when I received a letter from my father's sister. It wasn't sad news, just memories. But she made quite a show of pointing out my excessive emotional display to everyone present." "Those women," Luke said, a rare anger coloring his voice, "have nothing better to do than tear others down to feel important. Your tears are your own, Miss Armstrong. There's no shame in feeling deeply. Delilah looked up, meeting his intense blue gaze. You said something similar when we first met, about crying because I still feel. I meant it, he said simply. This country, this life, it hardens people, makes them shut away their feelings just to survive. But that's no way to live. You seem to manage well enough, she observed. I've never seen you shed a tear. A shadow crossed his face. That doesn't mean I don't feel, Miss Armstrong, just that I've had different lessons in how to carry my burdens. There was something in his voice that hinted at old wounds, and Delilah suddenly realized how little she actually knew about Luke Patterson beyond the basics he'd shared that first day at lunch. Will you tell me? She asked softly. About those lessons? For a moment she thought he might refuse, but then he leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant with memory. My father was a hard man, he began. Not cruel, exactly, but unyielding. When I was 8, my dog died, an old hound that had been my constant companion. I was heartbroken, crying like the world had ended. My father took me aside and said, "Men don't cry, Luke. They act. They solve problems. They move forward." So I learned to swallow my tears, to channel grief and pain into work, into action. That sounds lonely, Delilah said. Luke's eyes refocused on her face. It was, is, but it's how I've survived. And your brother, you mentioned him before. David, Luke said, a hint of warmth entering his voice. He was always the softer one, more like our mother. When our parents died, influenza took them both within days of each other. I handled the funeral arrangements, settled the debts, sold the ranch. David grieved. Openly, honestly. I envied him that freedom, even as I resented having to be the strong one. And you haven't seen him since he went to California? Luke shook his head. We write occasionally. He's married now, with 2 children. Seems happy. He paused, then added more quietly. Sometimes I wonder if he made the wiser choice, allowing himself to feel rather than just endure. The confession hung between them, intimate in a way their previous conversations had not been. Delilah felt a deepening connection to this complex man who understood her tears when others mocked them. Perhaps, she suggested carefully, there's a middle path. Feeling deeply doesn't have to mean being overcome, and strength doesn't have to mean being stone. Luke regarded her thoughtfully. You may be right, Miss Armstrong. I suspect you know more about that balance than I do. Before Delilah could respond, they heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Luke stood, the moment of openness passing as he resumed his usual composed demeanor. That'll be Mr. Jenkins with the lumber for the new corral. I should go help him unload. Delilah nodded, rising as well. And I should finish preparing dinner. Will Mr. Jenkins be staying? If you've made enough, I'll ask him. As Luke headed outside, Delilah returned to her cooking, but her mind remained on their conversation. For the first time, she had glimpsed beneath Luke Patterson's controlled exterior, and what she'd seen there intrigued her more than she cared to admit. Summer advanced, bringing scorching heat to the Wyoming territory. The Patterson Ranch, as it was now known, was gradually transforming under Luke's careful stewardship. The house gleamed with fresh paint and new curtains. The barn stood solid and welcoming. A small herd of cattle grazed in the eastern pasture, and a vegetable garden flourished behind the house, Delilah's special project. She continued to work for Luke 3 days a week, but their relationship had subtly shifted. The formal Miss Armstrong and Mr. Patterson had given way to Delilah and Luke when they were alone. Their conversations ranged beyond household matters to books they had read, places they had seen, and dreams they harbored. Delilah found herself looking forward to her days at the ranch with an eagerness that had nothing to do with the income they provided. On a particularly hot August afternoon, Delilah was putting the finishing touches on a blackberry pie when Luke entered the kitchen, his shirt damp with sweat from repairing fences in the midday sun. "Something smells wonderful," he said, washing his hands at the pump. "The blackberries were perfect at the edge of the creek," Delilah replied, sliding the pie onto the windowsill to cool. "I thought you deserved a treat after working in this heat." Luke dried his hands and leaned against the counter, watching her with a small smile. "You spoil me, Delilah. I'm not sure what I did to deserve such care." "You gave me work when I needed it most," she said simply. "And you've been a good friend." She hesitated over the last word, uncertain if it adequately described what had grown between them over the summer months. "Is that what we are? Friends?" Luke's voice was casual, but his eyes held a question that made Delilah's heart beat faster. Before she could answer, a rider appeared in the yard, approaching the house at a gallop. Luke frowned and moved to the door, Delilah close behind him. It was Tom Garfield, the son of the general store owner, his young face flushed with excitement or exertion. "Mr. Patterson, Miss Armstrong," he called, reining in his horse. "Pa sent me to fetch you both. There's trouble in town, a big fire at the hotel. Everyone's helping to put it out." Luke was already moving, grabbing his hat. "Delilah, stay here where it's safe." "Absolutely not," she countered, reaching for her own hat. "I'm coming with you. People might need help." He looked as though he might argue, but after a moment's hesitation he nodded. "Stay close to me then. Tom, ride ahead and tell your pa we're coming." As the boy galloped back toward town, Luke and Delilah quickly saddled their horses. The ride into Cottonwood Springs took less than 20 minutes at a hard gallop, and as they crested the final hill, they could see black smoke billowing into the summer sky. The scene in town was chaos. The hotel, a 3-story wooden structure that was the pride of Cottonwood Springs, was engulfed in flames. Men formed a bucket brigade from the town well to the burning building, while women tended to the injured and frightened hotel guests who had escaped. Luke immediately joined the firefighting effort, taking a position in the line of men passing buckets. Delilah hurried to where Mrs. Collins was organizing care for those affected by the fire. "Oh, Delilah. Thank goodness," the Reverend's wife said when she spotted her. "We need all the help we can get. Can you take over here?" She gestured to where a young woman sat on a bench, clutching a sobbing child to her chest, both of them covered in soot. Delilah nodded and approached them, speaking softly. "Are you hurt? Let me help you." The woman looked up, her eyes wide with shock. "My husband. He went back in for our things. I told him not to, but—" She broke off, her gaze fixed on the burning building. Delilah's heart sank, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Let me look after your little one while you rest. What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked the child, a girl of perhaps 4 or 5. "Emma," the girl whispered, her face streaked with tears and ash. "That's a beautiful name," Delilah said, gently wiping the child's face with a damp cloth. "I'm Delilah. Everything's going to be all right, Emma." As she tended to the child and her mother, Delilah kept one eye on the firefighting efforts. The men were working valiantly, but the hotel was old and dry, and the flames seemed to be winning. Then, to her horror, she heard a shout from one of the men. "There's someone at the window. 3rd floor." Delilah looked up to see a figure silhouetted in an upper window, waving frantically. The staircase inside must have collapsed, trapping whoever was still in the building. Without hesitation, Luke broke from the bucket line and ran toward the hotel, ignoring the shouts of the other men. Delilah felt her heart stop as she watched him disappear into the smoke-filled entrance. "Luke!" she cried, rising to her feet, but Mrs. Collins caught her arm. "Delilah, no, you can't go after him." Frozen with fear, Delilah could only watch and pray as the minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. The flames continued to spread, and the structure of the hotel was beginning to groan ominously. Just when she thought all hope was lost, Two figures emerged from the smoke. Luke, supporting a middle-aged man who was clearly struggling to walk. They had barely cleared the building when, with a tremendous crash, the upper floors collapsed. Luke and the man he'd rescued were thrown forward by the force of it, landing hard on the dusty street as burning debris rained down around them. Delilah broke free from Mrs. Collins and ran to Luke's side. He was conscious but dazed, his face blackened with soot, his shirt singed in several places. "Luke, are you hurt? Can you stand?" Her hands moved over him anxiously, checking for injuries. He coughed violently, then focused on her face. "I'm all right," he rasped. "Check on him." He nodded toward the man he'd rescued, who was already being tended to by others. "You fool," Delilah whispered, tears streaming down her face as she helped Luke to a sitting position. "You could have been killed." "Couldn't leave him there," Luke managed between coughs. Dr. Harrison, the town physician, made his way to them and knelt beside Luke, his experienced hands checking for broken bones or serious burns. "You're a lucky man, Patterson," he declared after a thorough examination. "Some minor burns on your hands and arms, smoke in your lungs, but nothing that won't heal with proper care." He looked at Delilah. "Can you take him home and keep an eye on him tonight? I've got more serious cases to attend to." "Of course," she said, relieved that Luke's injuries weren't life-threatening. With help from two of the men, they got Luke onto his horse. Delilah mounted her own mare, and they rode slowly back to the ranch, the excitement of the day giving way to exhaustion. At the house, Delilah helped Luke inside and sat him at the kitchen table while she prepared a basin of cool water and bandages. His hands were blistered from the heat, and angry red patches marked his forearms where burning embers had landed on his skin. "These need to be cleaned," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It will hurt." Luke nodded, extending his hands. "Do what you need to do." Delilah worked methodically, cleaning the burns and applying the salve Dr. Harrison had given her. Luke remained silent throughout, though she could feel him tense when she touched the worst of the blisters. "The man you rescued," she said as she bandaged his right hand. "Do you know who he was?" Luke shook his head. "Never seen him before. Traveling salesman, I think. He was unconscious when I found him, must have been overcome by the smoke." "You risked your life for a stranger," Delilah said softly. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't. You did." She finished with the bandages and sat back, suddenly aware of how intimate the moment felt, the two of them alone in his kitchen, the summer twilight deepening outside the windows. "Why?" Luke met her gaze, his blue eyes serious in his smoke-streaked face. "Because every life has value, Delilah. Because I could help. So I had to try." A fresh wave of tears filled her eyes, and for once, she made no attempt to hide them. "I was so afraid," she confessed. "When you ran into that building, I thought—" She broke off, unable to articulate the terror she had felt. "You were crying for me," Luke said, a note of wonder in his voice. He lifted one bandaged hand to her face, gently brushing away a tear with his thumb. "No one has cried for me in a very long time." Delilah leaned into his touch, her heart pounding. "I care about you, Luke. More than I should, perhaps." "And I care about you," he replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "More than I've ever cared for anyone." The confession hung between them, changing everything. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Luke leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle kiss. Delilah had never been kissed before, but her body seemed to know how to respond. Her hand came up to cup his cheek, mindful of any injuries, as she returned the kiss with a tenderness that matched his own. When they separated, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" He smiled slightly. "I was afraid you'd cry." "And now?" Now I hope you might cry only happy tears, he said, brushing his lips against hers once more. They stayed like that for a long moment, the world outside forgotten as they reveled in this new understanding between them. Finally, Delilah pulled back, her practical nature reasserting itself. You need to rest, she said firmly. Doctor's orders, and I should get home before it's fully dark. Luke frowned. You can't ride back to town alone at this hour, it's not safe. I can't stay here, Luke. My reputation is already the subject of gossip, he finished for her. But you're right. He thought for a moment. Take my bed. I'll sleep out here on the settee. No one need ever know. Delilah hesitated, but the thought of the long ride back to town in the darkness was unappealing, especially given the events of the day. Very well, but only because you need someone to keep an eye on you tonight. Luke smiled. Whatever reason you choose, I'm glad you're staying. The next morning, Delilah woke early in Luke's comfortable bed, momentarily disoriented before remembering the events of the previous day. She dressed quickly and moved quietly through the house, finding Luke asleep on the settee in the parlor. One bandaged hand resting on his chest as he breathed deeply. Not wanting to wake him, she slipped into the kitchen and began preparing breakfast. The familiar tasks stoking the stove, mixing biscuit dough, slicing bacon helped calm her racing thoughts. What had happened between them last night had changed everything, and she needed time to sort through her feelings. She was setting the coffee to boil when Luke appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep, his eyes still heavy-lidded. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough. "How long have you been up?" "Not long. How do you feel?" He flexed his bandaged hands carefully. "Sore, but better than I expected. The rest helped." Delilah nodded, suddenly shy in the morning light. "Breakfast will be ready soon. You should sit." Luke didn't move from the doorway. "Delilah, about last night." "We don't need to discuss it now," she interrupted quickly. "You were injured. Emotions were running high." "I meant every word," he said firmly, "every gesture. It wasn't just the excitement of the moment." Delilah looked at him then, taking in the earnestness of his expression. "As did I," she admitted softly. "But Luke, what happens now? I work for you. People already talk. And I don't know how to be what you might want." He crossed the kitchen and stood before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "All I want is you, Delilah. Exactly as you are. The woman who cries because she feels deeply. Who works hard without complaint. Who sees value in everyone around her." He took a deep breath. "I'm not good with fancy words or grand gestures, but I know what I feel. I'm falling in love with you." The declaration stole her breath. "Luke, you don't need to say anything now," he assured her quickly. "I know it's sudden. I just wanted you to know where I stand." He smiled slightly. "And to tell you that I don't want you as my housekeeper anymore." "Oh," Delilah said, disappointment flooding through her despite his declaration of feelings. The income from her work at the ranch had become essential. Luke must have read her expression because he laughed softly. "Not because I don't want you here, but because I hope, in time, you might consider being here as something else entirely." Hope bloomed in her chest. "Something else?" "My wife," he said simply. "Not immediately, I know we need time, but eventually, if you think you could be happy with me." Delilah's eyes filled with tears again. Happy ones? Just as he had predicted the night before. "I think I could," she whispered, "very happy indeed." The bacon began to sizzle, drawing them back to the present moment. Luke stepped away, giving her space to tend to the cooking, but the atmosphere in the kitchen had changed, filled with possibility and a new, tentative joy. After breakfast, Luke insisted on riding back to town with Delilah, despite his injured hands. "We'll check on how things are in town after the fire," he said as they saddled the horses. "And I need to speak with Reverend Collins." "About what?" Delilah asked, puzzled. Luke gave her a mysterious smile. "Just some advice I need. Nothing for you to worry about." They rode side by side, talking easily about the ranch and plans for the autumn. As they approached Cottonwood Springs, they could see that much of the town had gathered around the charred remains of the hotel. The building was a total loss, but thankfully, no lives had been lost, thanks in large part to Luke's heroic actions. As they dismounted in front of the general store, they were immediately surrounded by townspeople eager to thank Luke and check on his condition. Delilah stood back, watching with pride as he modestly accepted their gratitude. To her surprise, even Harriet Simmons approached, her usual haughty expression tempered by something that almost looked like respect. "Mr. Patterson," she said, extending her hand, "the town owes you a debt of gratitude. My husband says your quick thinking saved not only Mr. Reynolds but possibly the entire block had the fire spread." Luke shook her hand briefly. "Just did what needed doing, Mrs. Simmons. Anyone would have done the same." "Perhaps," she conceded, her eyes sliding to Delilah. "Miss Armstrong, I understand you provided care afterward. That was commendable." It was as close to an apology as Harriet Simmons was likely to offer for months of snide remarks and cruel gossip. Delilah inclined her head graciously. "Thank you, Mrs. Simmons. We all do what we can in times of crisis." As Harriet moved away, Luke leaned closer to Delilah. "Well now, I think you've been accepted into Cottonwood Springs society at last," he murmured, amusement coloring his voice. "It only took a near-death experience on your part," she replied dryly. "Hardly seems worth the price." "I'd run into a burning building every day if it meant seeing you happy," he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. Delilah felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Don't you dare. I've had quite enough excitement for 1 week." They made their way through the crowd, checking on those who had been injured and offering assistance where needed. The man Luke had rescued, Mr. Reynolds, was recovering at Dr. Harrison's home and sent his profound thanks through the doctor's wife. By midday, they had done all they could in town, and Luke suggested they return to the ranch. "I still need to tend to the cattle, burns or no burns," he said, "and there's something I want to show you." Curious, Delilah agreed. They rode back more slowly than they had come, enjoying the summer day and each other's company. At the ranch, Luke asked Delilah to wait on the porch while he disappeared into the barn. He returned carrying a small wooden box, which he set carefully on the porch railing. "I've been working on this in my spare time," he explained, opening the lid. "It's not quite finished, but after yesterday, I don't want to wait any longer." Inside the box, nestled in a scrap of velvet, was a delicate ring. The band was silver, twisted into an intricate pattern that resembled flowing water, with a small but perfect pearl set in the center. "Luke," Delilah breathed, staring at the ring in astonishment. "Did you make this?" He nodded, a hint of uncertainty in his expression. "My father taught me metalwork when I was young. I haven't practiced much in recent years, but I wanted to make something special. For you." "It's beautiful," she whispered, touching the ring gently with one fingertip. "It's a promise ring," Luke explained. "Not quite an engagement ring, not yet. But a promise that I'm serious about my intentions, that I want to court you properly, with everyone in town knowing my feelings." He took her hand in his bandaged one. "Delilah Armstrong, will you allow me to court you, with the hope that someday you'll agree to be my wife?" Tears welled in Delilah's eyes for what felt like the 100th time since she'd met Luke Patterson, but these were different from any she'd shed before, pure joy, unmingled with grief or fear or doubt. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tears. "Yes, Luke, I will. With careful movements, hindered by his bandages, Luke slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her, which, of course, it had been. I meant what I said yesterday, he told her, his eyes never leaving hers. I love how deeply you feel. Delilah, I love your tears as much as your smiles, because they show me your heart. And I love your strength, she replied, not the kind that hides feelings away, but the kind that runs into burning buildings to save strangers, the kind that defends a weeping woman when others mock her. Luke smiled, drawing her into his arms. We make a good match, then. We do, Delilah agreed, resting her head against his chest. Though I hope our future contains fewer burning buildings. His laugh rumbled beneath her ear. I'll do my best to accommodate that wish, my love. The autumn months passed in a whirl of activity and joy for Delilah. True to his word, Luke courted her properly, calling at her home in town, escorting her to church functions, and taking her for long rides across his growing property. The gossips of Cottonwood Springs found themselves with far less ammunition now that Luke's intentions were openly declared and approved by Reverend Collins, who had known of Luke's plans even before the hotel fire. Delilah continued to work at the ranch 3 days a week, but now it was with an eye to the future, learning the rhythms of the place that would someday be her home, helping Luke plan expansions and improvements, planting flower beds that would bloom in their first spring together. By the time the first snowfall blanketed the Wyoming landscape, Luke's promise ring had been replaced with a proper engagement band, this one purchased in Cheyenne, where they had traveled together, chaperoned by Mrs. Collins, to buy supplies for the winter. They set the wedding date for April, when the worst of the winter would be past and the land would be beginning to green again. Delilah, with the help of the church ladies who had become true friends over the months, began preparations for the ceremony and for her transition from the small house in town to Luke's ranch. On Christmas Eve, a surprise arrival at the ranch changed their plans. Delilah had stayed to help Luke decorate a small pine tree he had cut from his property, planning to return to town before dark for the Christmas Eve service. They were hanging the last of the ornament's simple wooden stars Luke had carved when they heard a wagon approaching. Luke frowned, setting aside the ornament he was holding. I'm not expecting anyone. Stay here while I check. Delilah watched through the window as Luke strode out to meet the wagon. The driver was bundled against the cold, his face obscured by a heavy scarf, but as he climbed down, something in his movements made Luke freeze in place. Then, to Delilah's astonishment, the two men embraced. Curious, she opened the door and stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders against the biting cold. Delilah, Luke called, his voice carrying an excitement she'd never heard before. Come meet my brother. The stranger unwound his scarf, revealing a face that bore a striking resemblance to Luke's, though his features were somewhat softer, his hair a shade lighter. David Patterson, he said, extending a gloved hand as Delilah approached. And this is my wife, Sarah, and our children, Thomas and Rebecca. He gestured to the wagon, where a woman and 2 small children were huddled under blankets. What are you doing here? Luke asked, helping Sarah and the children down from the wagon. Your letter said you were settled in California. We were, David replied, his expression turning serious. But Sarah's father passed last month, and she has no other family there. When I wrote to tell you the news, I realized how much I missed you, brother. How much I wanted my children to know their uncle. He looked around at the ranch. Your letters made this place sound like paradise. We thought, if you have room for us, even just until we find our own place. Room? Luke laughed, clapping his brother on the shoulder. David, I have 160 acres and a house big enough for 3 families. You're welcome to stay as long as you like forever, if it suits you. Delilah watched the reunion with tears in her eyes, happy tears, the kind Luke had taught her to embrace rather than hide. As if sensing her thoughts, He turned and beckoned her closer. David, Sarah, this is my fiancée, Delilah Armstrong. We're to be married in April. David's eyebrows rose in delighted surprise. A fiancée? Your letters mentioned a special lady, but I had no idea things had progressed so far. He smiled warmly at Delilah. It's a pleasure to meet the woman who captured my stubborn brother's heart. The pleasure is mine, Delilah replied sincerely. Luke has told me so much about you. Please, come inside where it's warm. We were just decorating for Christmas. As they ushered the tired travelers into the house, Luke caught Delilah's hand, holding her back for a moment on the porch. Are you all right with this? He asked quietly. It changes our plans quite a bit. Delilah smiled up at him. It's a wonderful change, Luke. Family is the greatest gift we could receive this Christmas. Her eyes twinkled with sudden mischief. Though it does mean we'll need to expand the house sooner than we planned. Luke kissed her lightly. We'll manage. We always do. And they did manage. Not just through that Christmas, but through the years that followed. The April wedding went ahead as planned, though with the addition of Luke's brother and his family, the celebration was larger and more joyous than they had initially envisioned. David and Sarah built their own small house on the eastern edge of the property by the following winter, but the families remained inseparable. The brothers worked the land together, gradually expanding their cattle operation until the Patterson Ranch became one of the most prosperous in the territory. Delilah found in Sarah not just a sister-in-law, but a true friend, someone who understood the challenges and joys of frontier life. Together, they established a small school on the ranch property, where Delilah finally put her teaching skills to use, instructing not only Thomas and Rebecca, but eventually her own children as well. For Delilah gave Luke 3 children over the years, 2 boys and a girl, each with their father's blue eyes and their mother's sensitive heart. And unlike his own father, Luke taught his sons that there was no weakness in tears, no shame in feeling deeply. Your mother taught me that, he would tell them. She cries because she still feels. And that's the greatest strength a person can have. The gossips of Cottonwood Springs eventually found other targets for their whispers, especially after Harriet Simmons's husband lost the bank in a bad investment and they were forced to move away. Delilah, once mocked for her tears, became a respected member of the community known for her compassion, her teaching, and the warm welcome that awaited any traveler who stopped at the Patterson Ranch. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the work of the day was done, Luke and Delilah would sit on their porch, watching the stars emerge over the Wyoming landscape they both loved. Any regrets? Luke would sometimes ask, his arm around his wife's shoulders, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. And Delilah, thinking of the long journey from grief-stricken schoolteacher's daughter to beloved wife, mother, and teacher, would smile and shake her head. Not one, she would reply, her heart full, not a single tear wasted. For she had learned, as had Luke, that the capacity to feel deeply, to cry in sorrow and in joy, was not a weakness to be hidden, but a gift to be treasured. It was what had drawn them together on that dusty street years before, when a grieving woman's tears had touched the heart of a lonely cowboy. It was what had built their home, raised their children, and sustained their love through all the seasons of their lives together on the frontier they had tamed, not with hardness, but with open hearts that never forgot how to feel.